Story time about how I found out I was born from incest. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It's sending me on Instagram. Growing up, I always wondered why we didn't have a family. I mean, I had both my parents, but we never visited my grandparents, cousins, parents until I turned 15. That's when I started getting curious and I started asking questions. Finally, I asked my parents about my grandparents. I remember meeting them when I was a kid. That's when my dad got really upset. He told me to stop asking questions because we didn't need family. I immediately went onto Facebook. It wasn't hard to find my aunt, my mom's sister. I messaged her and she told me something disturbing. She said my mom and dad were related. They were half brother and sister. Part 2 is up. Time about how I found out I was born out of incest. Disclaimer, is not my story time. It's sending me on Instagram. When my aunt told me the disturbing truth. My mom and dad were half brother and sister. According to my aunt, when they were in high school, they always spent time together. Everyone just thought they were best friends. But apparently my aunt walked in on them making out one day. When she told her parents, my grandparents, they obviously freaked out and tried to separate them. That's when they tried to send my dad to a military school. 1 week before they sent him, my mom and dad decided to run away together. They finally ran away and never spoke to their family again until I was born. My grandmother begged them to get rid of me. My parents kept me. Part 3 is up. Story time about how I found out I was born out of incest. Disclaimer, is not my story time. It's not me on Instagram. After I was born, my grandmother begged my mom to give me up for adoption. My parents were both 18 when they had me. Not only were they jobless, they were also half brother and sister. Since my parents had ran away from home, my grandparents didn't want to help them financially. Luckily, my parents started their own business and they are successful today. Finding out that my parents are half brother and sister, I understand our family history and why we were never close to our family. Finally confronted my parents and they denied everything. I decided I'd do the same thing they did. I ran away for 3 nights, hid in my bestie's basement. Finally, my parents came over and told me the entire truth. My parents do love me, but they keep me away from my family. What should I do? Should I forgive them? Story time about how my gay best friend confessed that he is not gay and he's actually straight and he's actually in love with me. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I sent me on Instagram. Let's call him Ted. Ted and I met in 10th grade. Now let me be clear. I did not think he was gay. In fact, I knew that he was hooking up with other girls. He was attractive and one of the most popular guys in school. I knew for a fact that he was hooking up with the most popular girls in school. He befriended me. He told me that he was secretly gay, but I was the only person he had ever told. We became besties. He started telling me about the guys he liked, about guys he had hooked up with, and I started telling him all my dirty secrets too. We would sleep over at his house almost every other weekend. He would sleep over at my house almost every other weekend. But we were together every single day and every single weekend. His parents loved me. Dad would always say things like, I can't wait for you and Ted to get married. And I would just stay quiet thinking, oh my gosh, if you only knew, you have a gay son. For 3 years, his parents thought we were in a relationship, all because he wanted to cover the fact that he was gay. After graduating high school, we went to the same university and we decided to be roommates. In front of people, he acted like my boyfriend. He would kiss my neck and hold my hand. It gets so much worse. Go to part 2. Story time about how my gay best friend confessed that he is not gay and that he is actually in love with me. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It's on Instagram. After deciding to become roommates and moving in together, he was still acting like he was my boyfriend in front of other people. Because according to him, our friends and his family would never accept that he was gay. Anytime we were in front of people, he would grab my hand, kiss my neck, and just act like a couple. Now, living together was fun. We would go to parties together and he would always take care of me. I was still changing in front of him, was still telling him all of my secrets. This man would wash my underwear. That's how comfortable I was with him. One night I told him I had a huge crush on this guy. That's when he told me that we should practice kissing so that I could kiss with my crush. I was a little bit tipsy, so I accepted. 10 minutes into my kissing lesson, he starts putting his hand on places he shouldn't. That's when he confessed that he's never been gay. He only told me that lie in high school to get close to me, that the lie grew so much that he couldn't retract. Then he tried to kiss me again, pushed him away and told him that what he had done was abuse. I felt completely violated. Kicked him out of the apartment, of course, and I told his parents and mine. My dad went to his house and punched him in the face. He's been getting therapy for it now. Should I report him or something? Story time about how my creepy uncle flirts with me. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It's sending me on Instagram. I finally told my dad and he told my uncle to stop making comments. My uncle just laughed and told my dad that he was overreacting. And that all he said to me was that I was a pretty girl. What a liar. In part 1 and 2, I told you guys that it was getting worse, but here's where it actually gets even worse. Like I said, I have a really big family, so my cousins are growing up too. One of them just turned 13 and my uncle cannot stop staring at her. She's maturing a lot quicker than most 13-year-olds. He's already staring at her. So here's what I did. At the next family event, I sat right next to him. Every time he would stare at one of my cousins or try to make a comment at me, I called him out for it in front of everybody. I even recorded the things that he said. The fact that I even have to do this at a family event makes me sick. Instead of enjoying my time with my family, I have to sit next to my creepy uncle policing him. Anyway, it's totally worth it though. I'm making sure that my cousins don't feel uncomfortable. After I had enough recordings of him saying nasty things, at the next family event, I showed it to my grandma. I basically played it for the entire family. My grandma told him that he couldn't come to any more events if he was going to behave that way. And of course, he apologized to everyone right away. But not to me, he apologized to my dad. After his half-ass apology, he was let back into family events. I don't think that's enough punishment. Give me some ideas because I think I deserve justice. Creepy uncle. wine. So we ended up doing it for the first time that night. The next morning when I woke up, the first thing he said to me was, "Do you ever exercise?" I was shocked. Part 2 is up. Story time about how my boyfriend shames me for having cellulite. Disclaimers are not my story time. I sent me on Instagram. That's when he said point blank, super serious, "Do you ever exercise?" I just stared at him. I had literally just woken up in his bed after the first time we ever did it. Then I thought he must be joking. So I started to laugh a little, and then he says, "No, seriously, do you ever exercise?" I said, "Sometimes." Then he told me, "You should really try to work out at least 5 times a week." I went home and finally texted him saying that I wasn't comfortable with the way he spoke to me. That's when he said that what he said to me was completely normal and that I shouldn't be offended. This was all in text, by the way. That's when he sends me another text message saying, "You wouldn't have as much cellulite as you do if you didn't eat so much fast food. And if you exercise 5 times a week like I told you." I didn't reply to him for the rest of the day. Later that day, he shows up to my apartment and says, "I should feel comfortable enough to tell you what I think about you." He somehow ended up making me feel bad and I ended up apologizing. Obviously, after that, I became really self-conscious about my cellulite and my entire body. So anytime we were together, I would always stay under the covers. By the way, my boyfriend doesn't have a great body. He's super soft and pudgy. Last week, he told me that he had abs though. Part 3 is story time about how my boyfriend shames me for having cellulite. Disclaimers, now my story time is sending me on Instagram. One day, he pulls up his shirt and says, "Look, I have abs." Which, no, he doesn't. He's super soft and has a thick layer of fat on it. I smirked and he said, "What?" And I said, "You don't have abs." Then he says, "Yes, I do. I'm in better shape than you." By the way, he said this in front of his friends, so I was super embarrassed and stayed quiet the entire day. He finally went to drop me off and I was so happy to be home. But he decided to come upstairs with me. Got straight into my PJs. And when I came out of my bedroom, he says, "Wow, your cellulite's getting worse by the day." That's when I finally broke. I turned around and started yelling at him. I told him he had no right to talk about my body the way that he did, and that all he does is objectify me. He started laughing and said, "Wow, those are big words." And that when we met, he thought that I was in better shape. My clothes obviously tricked him. I'm 5'4" and I weigh 130 pounds. I am by no means fat, but the way that he was bullying me was making me think that I was. That's when I told him that he was the fat one, and that he had a big, huge beer belly. I also told him that his face was super round, but that didn't bother me. Oh yeah, and that his hairy back was gross. Then he said, "Wow, I can't believe you're attacking my physical appearance." Then he stormed out of my apartment, and as soon as he left, I felt happy. We haven't spoken in 4 days. I'm afraid that if he asks me to get back with him, I will. But I should just break up with him, right? What should I do? Story time about how my creepy uncle flirts with me. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. Send me on Instagram. I come from a really big family. My mom has 5 sisters and 1 brother, and my dad has 4 brothers and sisters. All of them have their own kids, so I have a lot of cousins. And this means we have a lot of family get-togethers. Every single weekend, someone is hosting a party. We all get together and eat, and it's actually a really nice time. But there's always that one creepy uncle. In my case, it's my mom's brother. He's 46-year-old and has never married, but he's a bachelor. He's got money, so he basically has a bunch of sugar babies. Whenever my family tells him that he needs to get married, he says he'll never get married to anybody. He thinks women only exist for the pleasure of men. When I turned 16, I noticed that he would stare at me a lot. At first, it was just staring. Every now and again, he never did anything really creepy then, but just the staring was enough for me. I never told my mom about it then, not until I turned 18. This is when he started making comments like, "Wow, you're growing into your body," or "Wow, you got great hips." He would make comments about how I was growing up, like, "Ew." He even told my dad that he needed to keep me away from guys because I was growing up really quickly. And because of my curves, men would think that I was a woman. This is when I finally told my mom that he was making me super uncomfortable. She thought it was funny at first, so I avoided him at all costs. Part 2. Story time about how my creepy uncle flirts with me. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It's me on Instagram. When I told my mom that he was making me super uncomfortable, she laughed it off. She thought it was funny. She said, "Oh, you know how he is." So from that point on, I basically avoided my uncle every time we were at a family event. When I turned 20, this is when things got even worse. He would ask me things like if I was a virgin, or if I had a boyfriend, if I had ever been on dates. And one time he even told me that he would get very jealous if I ended up bringing a guy to one of our family events. One time he complimented me on the dress that I was wearing, so after that, I only wore baggy clothes to family events. The fact that I had to change the way that I dress so that he could control himself makes me sick. I finally told my mom again that my uncle was always bothering me. That's when she told me that the world is filled with men like him, and that all I needed to do was just ignore him. So I told my dad everything. My dad took it a little more seriously and told my uncle that he needed to stop making comments. My uncle just laughed. Part 3 is up. Story time about how my creepy uncle flirts with me. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. Send me on Instagram. I finally told my dad and he told my uncle to stop making comments. My uncle just laughed and told my dad that he was overreacting, and that all he said to me was that I was a pretty girl. What a liar. In part 1 and 2, I told you guys that it was getting worse, but here's where it actually gets even worse. Like I said, I have a really big family, so my cousins are growing up too. One of them just turned 13, and my uncle cannot stop staring at her. She's maturing a lot quicker than most 13-year-olds. He's already staring at her. So here's what I did. At the next family event, I sat right next to him. Every time he would stare at one of my cousins or try to make a comment at me, I called him out for it in front of everybody. I even recorded the things that he said. The fact that I even have to do this at a family event makes me sick. Instead of enjoying my time with my family, I have to sit next to my creepy uncle policing him. Anyway, it's totally worth it.
it though. I'm making sure that my cousins don't feel uncomfortable. After I had enough recordings of him saying nasty things, at the next family event, I showed it to my grandma. I basically played it for the entire family. My grandma told him that he couldn't come to any more events if he was going to behave that way. And of course, he apologized to everyone right away. But not to me, he apologized to my dad. After his half-ass apology, he was let back into family events. I don't think that's enough punishment. Give me some ideas because I think I deserve justice. Creepy uncle.
Storytime about how I became an IG model / escort for billionaires. Tell you that last month I made $60,000. Disclaimer, this is not my story time and send me on Instagram. So at the beginning I had to lie about my age. I'm really 36 years old, but I say I'm 22. I do look a lot younger than I am, and of course I get filler and Botox. I started my Instagram account 6 years ago. My inspirations were Anna Cherie, Amanda Lee, Sam Jojo, and Abigail Ratchford. I mean Abigail Ratchet. I basically copied all of these girls' pictures. Within a month of starting my Instagram account, I had 10,000 followers. And yes, all of them were males. But I didn't really start making money until 2018. You know, like every other girl on Instagram, I signed up for OF. And that's when I started making serious money. But I was also making money from Instagram. Brands would send me clothes and watches and protein powders, stuff like that. Eventually, I became an ambassador for one of the biggest Instagram clothing stores. I think we all know what I'm talking about. Fashion Hova, and I started making a lot of money then. So I basically started living above my means. I got myself a new apartment in Beverly Hills, and it was $6,000 a month. I also got myself a Mercedes, and I would exclusively shop at Air One. I would also go shopping at Rodeo Drive almost every day because I wanted the paparazzi to get pictures of me. And I even called the paparazzi on me a few times, so I had to pay them like $2,000 out of pocket. So yeah, I was spending a lot of money. Whatever money I got that month, I would literally spend it by the end. One month I spent $25,000 going out with friends. I would usually pick up the bill. This is what started getting me into trouble. Part 2 is story time about how I became an IG model / escort for billionaires. After I spent the $25,000 in 1 month, I decided I needed another income source. So I thought of escorting. One of my very good friends in LA was also an escort, and she told me about it, but I was like, I can't do that. But one day I called her and she told me everything. She gets contacted through Instagram by very, very rich men, like billionaires. I honestly didn't believe her at first, but then she showed me receipts. Her bank account had more than $1 million in it. She told me that she had only been doing it for 6 months. She put me in contact with several people and they had to verify a bunch of my stuff. But then after a week, I was finally in. I was really scared. I had to go get my passport renewed. This meant that I was going to be traveling internationally with men that I didn't know. A few days later, I get a message on Instagram from an account. The guy that owned this account was clearly very rich. It wasn't him contacting me, it was his assistant. He got my information and 2 days later, I was on a private plane. I landed in a foreign country and I spent the entire weekend with this guy. He didn't speak English. Basically took me around his city and showed me off for his friends. I honestly didn't feel uncomfortable at any point and he didn't try anything. In fact, he was actually super shy, but his friends on the other hand were really handsy. Part 3 is up. Storytime about how I became an Instagram model / escort for billionaires. That's when his friends started getting really handsy. We were in a really expensive high-rise and the apartment was literally worth millions. And I knew that all of these guys were used to getting whatever they wanted. One of the friends actually grabbed my arm and told me to sit on his lap, but I told him I couldn't. He wasn't the one that hired me to be there, so I had to go straight to the guy that hired me. I told him that his friends were making me uncomfortable and he said, okay, we should leave then. I was actually shocked that he listened to what I wanted. Now one of my regular clients and I travel with him almost every 2 months. So let me tell you how much he paid me. For the 3-day weekend, I ended up with $50,000. Yep, that's right. But let me tell you a little about the dark side of this. A few jobs later, I ended up with somebody who was completely crazy. I ended up going to Vegas with this guy. He was approximately 10 years younger than me and was filthy rich. But he was also a complete psycho. He bought me this whole outfit that he wanted me to wear the entire night. I told him I was more comfortable in my clothes. I was wearing a Fendi dress. It looked great. That's when he said, no, you're gonna wear this. I ended up walking around Vegas in a micro mini skirt and a bikini top. By the end of this night, he was getting really aggressive. I tried to stay quiet, hoping that he would just forget that I was in his car. Suddenly, he turned to look at me and wanted me to do something. When I said no, he grabbed me by the hair and told me that he owned me for the night. Then he said, I'll add an extra $20,000 in there for you. And it does get worse. But now I learned to save my money. I no longer pay for my friends' drinks and food. I still have my $6,000 apartment and I upgraded my car. I live like a princess. I also bought my parents a house though. It was definitely one of the happiest days of my life. And believe it or not, I actually did end up finding love. My boyfriend is okay with my job, but he just asked me to be safe. Of course, he asked me every day to quit because he wants to support me, but he can't give me the life I've given myself. What should I do? Storytime about how my grandma got married when she was 14 years old. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It's sent me on Instagram. So just picture it. I'm sitting with my 94-year-old grandma in the kitchen. And suddenly she starts talking about my grandpa. My grandpa passed away almost 10 years ago. And to be fair, they did have a wonderful marriage. By all accounts, and by all of my family's accounts, they were totally in love until the moment he took his last breath. Here's how the story goes. The first time they met, she was 12 years old. He had just gotten back from the war. She was walking home from school with her backpack, and my 27-year-old grandpa pulls up in his car. He starts to tell her that she's going to be his future wife, and that he's going to talk to her parents so that they can get married. Kept inviting her into his car, but she kept saying no. He followed her home from school every single day. As my grandma is telling the story, everyone is laughing except for me. Finally, one day he followed her to her house, knocked on the door, and requested to speak to my great-grandfather. They spoke for an hour, and that's when my great-grandpa promised my grandma to my grandpa, and he gave them permission to get married when she was 14. At first, he wanted them to get to know each other, so they started going on dates. Part 2 is up. Story time about how my grandma married my grandpa when she was 14. Disclaimer, this is not my story time, it's on Instagram. And if you want longer story times, go to my YouTube. This is when my great-grandfather promised my 12-year-old grandma to my 27-year-old grandfather. My great-grandpa thought that it would be best they wait 2 years so that they can get married when she's 14. In the meantime, he suggested that they start going out on dates. Yes, a 12-year-old girl and a 27-year-old man. By the way, as my grandma is telling this story, all of my cousins are laughing at this. I'm trembling in my seat. She explained to us that for those 2 years, my grandfather was on his best behavior, and that essentially they read books together, they walked together by the lake, and he would take her out to see movies. She said at the time it was a big deal. Going to the movies was like a big treat. I guess it made me feel better knowing that he didn't try to do anything to her at the time. Still, it's absolutely disgusting. Finally, the 2 years passed, and at this point, they're totally in love. They get married. Both their families attended this wedding. How did no one in their families think it was inappropriate? Watching a 14-year-old get married to a 29-year-old man? But it gets worse. Part 3 is up. Storytime about how my grandma married my grandpa when she was 14 years old and he was 29. Disclaimer, this is not my story time, it's on Instagram. This is the third and last part. And if you want longer story times, go to my YouTube. 2 years pass and they get married. My grandma even told us that the night of their wedding, my great-grandparents gifted them a night at a hotel so that they could have some privacy. You can imagine what happened. My grandmother described it as the most liberating night of her life. 2 months later, she was pregnant. Their first baby was born right before she turned 15, and then she got pregnant again at 15, and then at 17, and then at 18, 19, and finally 20. My grandfather got into oil in his late 20s. He made about $1 million by the time he was 35, so he was able to give them a very comfortable life. He purchased a manor. They had 3 housekeepers, 1 butler, and 4 nannies, and they had a really happy life. My grandma says my grandpa was always affectionate with her, and she said they blessed their bed every single night. After she finishes telling the story, all of my cousins laugh and think it's cute. I was disturbed. I asked her why it was okay to get married at such a young age. And then I said, would you have wanted me to get married when I was 14? That's when she said that times were just different back then. The war was happening, and people didn't know if they would live or die. She also said that when a catch like my grandfather turned up, most parents were looking for a man like my grandfather to marry off their daughters. Grandpa was educated, handsome, driven, had great work ethic, and he took care of her, which is what he promised my great-grandpa. And then when the children came, he more than took care of them. He even took care of my great-grandparents too. He ended up moving them into the manor in their old age, and they were fully taken care of by the staff. Apparently, the manor was big enough to fit in 4 families. Now, I loved my grandfather. He was a great, kind man, and I myself benefited off the generational wealth. He paid for my education, and I'm now a lawyer for it. But still, a huge part of me feels absolutely disgusted with the history of their love. Even though back then that might have been normal, I think it's horrendous. Yes, they had a great love story, but she was a child. Apparently, this was a big family secret. None of the uncles or my parents wanted us to know. I got into a huge argument with my parents for hiding this from me. They think I'm totally overreacting. Am I, though? I guess I'll need more therapy. What do you think? My boyfriend confessed he got his ex-girlfriend pregnant. Disclaimer, this is not my story time, was sending me on Instagram. This girl was completely obsessed with me. She stalked me for over a month. One day my boyfriend shows up to my parents' house bawling. That's when my dad told him that he needed to leave. My parents were terrified this girl would do something to me. And that's when he just said to us, she's pregnant. A few days before we went out on our first date, they ended up hooking up one last time. Apparently she had been begging him. She swears up and down that the baby is his, but my parents don't buy it. My boyfriend now feels extremely guilty for bringing her into my life. Now my boyfriend has to take her to all the doctor's appointments, and she asked me to step aside. I didn't know what else to do, so I broke up with him. With a caveat, we're still seeing each other in secret, but this has stopped her from stalking me. Once the baby's born, there will be a paternity test. I guess I'll update you guys then. Bye.